Hey, Kev. Thanks for having me. Yeah, everyone, nice to meet you. Kevin already told me how successful and popular these are and how much everyone's really here for Amy's top level thoughts on COVID trends at the end. So he told me that if people start dropping off, I get booted. So I'm going to try to keep your attention. So I'm going to pull up some slides and we'll try not to make you fall asleep. There'll be lots of charts, but I will also speak 10,000 miles a minute to try to make it moderately interesting. On Kevin's point, yeah. So technically, we are a news organization with a community of tech professionals. We help companies hire from that community because we keep their attention with news and journalism. But we track trends really closely on how economic and workforce and labor trends are happening across the marketplace. So that's what I'll talk about. There'll be some tech influence as I pull up these charts. But even if you feel like you're outside of the IT sector, one thing that we do know is tech is just largely influencing labor trends that show up across professional workforces, and that's showing up elsewhere too. Just making sure this is, as this loads up, that's all visible, right? And folks, if you want to get active in the chat, I will happily follow along. So I welcome all trolling of me. But also if there's questions along the side, can someone drop there? You guys are seeing these
We
slides,
are
right?
seeing, Chris. We do see your slides. Yep.
Great, beautiful. Okay, all right. Let's roll in. That's our smiling face. We're a 20-person news organization, as I said. We help companies hire from the community. So Great Resignation, you've heard this. You might even be bored by it. I want to just pause, though, and get into the specifics of what the heck is actually happening. And then I'll close out with some trends or best practices we're seeing about what do you do about it. So first, what it is, and then what do you do about it. So really quick, because I know we all lived this, but the last 18 months, it's hard to demonstrate how radical a change we experienced. In February 2020, about 5% of office hours were done at home. By April, it was nearly 2/3 of office hours. That is a radical, unprecedented, remarkable global trend that took place. And so we all know this. We all experienced it. Our movement completely stopped. A bunch of the stuff we hated, but a bunch of the stuff about remote work we started to like, and a lot more of us were exposed to it in new and interesting ways. We even found by summer into fall 2020, Americans were moving in the country in new and interesting ways. We are decades into a lack of decline of Americans. We move less today for jobs than we did in the 1970s. Not more, we move less. That was one of many things that were radically changed at first. Many of you may have found this, that worker of yours that was perhaps able to come to an office might have moved. Maybe they went with family. Maybe they went with a spouse. Maybe they just found that they could work remotely far off. This was a really radical shaking that accelerated early, relatively fringe trends of digital nomads, the idea of doing work in a different location than where your work has typically been done. And then in a bunch of markets, we saw a flip-flop of where people were going. We have about a 20-year trend of Americans moving to the South and Southwest. That was largely accelerated. Those of you, given that this is the Mid-Atlantic crew, a real surprise was that peak of tech workers moving to Philadelphia. This is LinkedIn data. This does show up into February 2021. Some of this continued. Some of this were folks going from high-cost New York and D.C. markets into either family, spouses, or friends in the Philadelphia area. But some of these appear to be longer-term trends. So we saw an acceleration of where people were moving. And on the whole, the story is going lower cost, particularly south and southwest in the country, though obviously Philadelphia area had a little bit of a gain there as a low-cost center. So folks are moving around. Another remarkable thing that we were seeing over the last 18 months was new businesses created. This is also very rare. We at Technically have been reporting for our entire 15-year history that we are a 40-year decline in rates of entrepreneurship. Millennials are less entrepreneurial than boomers. This was then radically upended in the last 18 months. We saw a surge in 2020, and it is continuing in 2021 with new companies being formed. This includes people who are working remotely and have found their commute time could be traded in for running a small e-commerce company. It also did result in changeover from folks from lower performing industry. And yes, Mike, we are going to get these slides out, by the way. I'm watching the chat if folks want to drop questions. We're watching a dramatic change. This is not what happened in 2008. This is not what happened in 2001. This is not what happened in the early 90s and late 80s recessions. When recessions take place, usually fewer companies are started. The narrative is wrong. Typically in recessions, we start fewer companies. This slide conveys that. We were in a decades-long decline, and then suddenly in the pandemic, something happened. Boomers and millennials, actually every generation, to the question on who's starting companies, it's across age demographics. It's something quite remarkable. Meanwhile, you'll be shocked to learn that we were reporting high levels of stress during work the last 18 months. Another bit of research that we technically reported on conveyed more than 90% of professionals that were surveyed, more than a 3,000 person survey, more than 90% reported that 2020 was the most stressful year of their career. You don't get surveys to have that level of agreement on nearly anything outside of like dictatorships. Those sorts of numbers were crazy to see how universal the experience of was strain. So we're moving. We are starting side companies and new ventures. There's enormous stress happening in 2020 and early 2021. We are all collectively feeling burnout at the collective stage we never have. This is a slide we've reported on, just recent research, about the mixed impact of what remote work did to us over the last 18 months. This is a really important nuance that I think is undertold. One reason we all instinctively love remote work is it does add to our productivity. Repeat and constant surveying through the years before the pandemic showed short-term tasks, particularly rote and repeat ones, but any individual acts by office workers when done remotely, at home or in any kind of quiet location, does boost productivity. But the long-term impacts of fully distributed work, a lack of sense of belonging, which is what this chart is showing. This is from BetterUp, which is a virtual coaching platform and was tracking more than 10,000 interactions between coaches and the folks that they were coaching, individual professionals. Our sense of belonging was radically declined over a period of time. And our opportunities for sparks for innovation, which obviously are very hard to quantify in the near term. We talk about that, but it's beginning to show up in the data. So remote work made us more productive, yes. But the reason we started feeling burnout is we were losing our sense of belonging with our coworkers, and we were missing the opportunities for unexpected sparks of innovation. That's where we're declining, and that's harder to tell a story around because all of us experience the short-term gain of productivity. Oh, I can get my coffee and I can do my email and I can then respond to that project quietly and no one annoys me. Great, productivity gain. But we're losing something bigger and wider. So all of that brought us to what the buzzword of 2021 became. The Great Resignation, Anthony Klontz, a management consulting and professor, coined the phrase early in 2021 as survey data began to show we were about to see unprecedented rates of quitting, which was a prognostication that proved true, as we'll see here in a moment. Why were folks going? And we're going to loop back to what do we do about this. But burnout was a blanket phrase we were using a lot in a whole lot of surveying. It did mean loss of sense of belonging, or I didn't think that my company stood up to the values that I wanted in this moment of stress and strain. More than a quarter of people left without any job lined up, which is a particularly unusually high rate. That trend has been growing. That is a millennial phenomenon that is growing, but it was a giant jump in people leaving without their next job lined up to take time or to deal. In the data, usually it's showing up about third or saying for rates of comp. We're going to come back to that. And I see in a great in the chat here, Christine notes, we're seeing a ton of examples of people doing different kind of performance bonuses or tying bonuses to retention. People are trying very different things. I think we can get to some of those approaches here in our time. So quitting rates were not the same all around. Many of you may know that economists tend to like a relatively frothy rate of quits because it shows confidence in an economy. We think that we can find their next opportunity, and we think it's a more efficient marketplace. As much as we all hate, too much turnover, some of it's quite healthy. You want new people coming into your organization. You want your people to be able to go to find their next opportunity. That is very healthy. You want to retain some core group, of course, but we want some churn. It's interesting that we saw lower rates of quit in some states that were showing some stagnant economic growth. So Pennsylvania and New York, relatively low rates of quit rates. They're among the lowest in the nation over the last 18 months. But it somewhat coincided with Pennsylvania's aging population and some lack of economic dynamism. So it wasn't necessarily a good story. The point here is you probably don't want to be Georgia, Kentucky, Idaho in the highest rates of quits. You probably don't also want to be on the total lowest. So just noting here, the quit rates is very, very noisy. And this is actually already an outdated chart here, because as you saw, once again in September, so I think the number now is 3 of the highest rates of quit months in the, I think 50 years, maybe a little bit less, of us having tracked quit rates. 3 of the highest months ever of quit rates were in 2021. So the Great Resignation is not a nonsense phrase. It is quite real. We were seeing massive turnover. And so that is what brought us here. We had a giant game of musical chairs. People were geographically moving. They were reevaluating whether they wanted to start their own business. They were questioning whether their company's values aligned with their own values, or just wanted a different workflow. When some companies were bringing people back to the office, we saw an uptick. We reported on Wilmington, Delaware, which some of you may be based there, had one of the country's highest rate of workers applying for remote work. That growth in remote work searches in Wilmington, Delaware, coincided with the financial services firms, the big credit card companies in Delaware, at first requiring people to come back to office. And there was a giant spike in professional workers looking for remote work. So this game of musical chairs are a whole bunch of professionals saying, I need to find my next opportunity. So as employers, this is a moment in which employers have lost hand over the history of capitalism. Capital tends to more often have control over labor, but right now it's a labor moment. And that's what, as employers, we need to understand and take lessons from. So what do we do? And actually, I do want to note, Lisa's great. Lisa dropped a question in the chat about, is there a range of industry in those quit rates? Absolutely. Healthcare, some low-wage workers were absolutely, healthcare and food service and hospitality, as you call out, Lisa, were absolutely higher. But we are seeing quit rates in professional office work. Actually, one of the biggest, because quit rates in hospitality was always higher than other industries, somewhat makes sense. So one of the biggest proportional increases in the quit rates were among middle managers. It was the 30 to 40 something professional in and around office work. That was a relatively stable demographic. They are some of the folks who disproportionately started quitting. They had a little bit of cushion financially, and they were having a big, almost kind of midlife crisis of, where do I want to be in my career? So some of the proportional increase came in other sectors. Okay, so, all right, this guy is ranting at me about things are weird. I already know that. What do I do? That's what we're going to move to. So, of course, it helps to start looking at what are the trends and why people left. This is one survey from earlier February 2021. I've seen some updated ones from the summer. These numbers are relatively consistent. Usually each survey is showing about a third of professionals say it's pure a compensation decision. I think I can get more in the marketplace. Remote work are bringing higher cost salaries into lower cost markets. So some of it is purely rational comp, though we'll come back to that in a moment. The other 2/3 you could basket as company culture. Work-life balance. How flexible is it? How recognized do I feel? Do the values of this company on an array of issues match with my own? It really helps to get to this nuance. Like, to Lisa's point in the chat that yes, there is some range by industry and that does matter. But a lot of these trends are showing relatively consistent across industry. So compensation will come to these company culture points. I want you to remember that in a way you could call 2/3 of them about how closely knit does someone feel to your workplace. So either you say comp is a leading indicator, or you say how connected people are to your company is the leading indicator. I do think one specific action, if you haven't already taken, is you have to go back and look at your salary bands. We are seeing, as many of you are perhaps nervously watching, inflation story. Still, the majority of economists expect this, to use the phrase of the last 18 months, to be transitory. Most are not expecting runaway inflation. The majority of economists are still predicting by summer we will begin to see that the lower single-digit rates of year-on-year inflation that we've come to expect over the last 10 years. So most are still expecting this to be somewhat transitory. But we've seen a big leveling up. So some of that comp push from labor is entirely rational. We are confronting that across industries of whether you're going to eat that into your margin, whether you're going to have to pass on price increases. That is a lively conversation. But yes, you need to address your salary bands right now, because a big chunk of folks are purely making it a compensation conversation. It's going to be messy for us. I think Lisa put it in the chat earlier. Some folks are doing it on performance bonus or other bonus structures if they're worried about the long-term change. This was an interesting slide that made the rounds in like economist nerd land. When we saw wage growth giant spike in 2020, the actual narrative here is because in the earliest days of the pandemic, unfortunately, or disproportionately low wage workers were the first folks to lose their jobs. Furlough schemes kept a lot of our higher wage office workers. So some of that data was a little bit messy. It was that a bunch of retail workers were fired, and so it shot up. But the tail end, the 2021 version of that chart, is starting to show we are seeing wage growth increase. It's running alongside inflation. Many of you will see, it's becoming quite common to report about this in general interest press, which a nerd like me loves to see. We're competing whether inflation or wage growth is going to win out. But the takeaway is this is real. This is not nonsense. We have to deal with it. Most folks don't think it'll last forever, but the next 6 to 8 months, this is part of our reality. So let's talk a bit about remote work, which I'm sure all of us might have very different opinions on, and I welcome being hollered at in the chat. But the surveys overwhelmingly show that anyone who has any kind of office worker crew has to address this. McKinsey says about 40% of office workers can work remotely. 40% of all American workers. It's well over half when you talk about office work. This is surging in job postings. We help companies hire. We are seeing it. We used to primarily deal with companies that hired tech or tech adjacent talent and mostly wanted them to come into an office. In the last 18 months, we have seen a radical change. Most are interested in some employees being near to their office, but they suddenly want to be able to hire anywhere. These are seeing it as a competitive advantage. We'll get to that. But we are seeing work from home, remote, distributed. This is surging in the expectations of professionals, and it comes with real company culture changes. But your labor workforce opportunities it's changing under your feet and very quickly. Folks we would have assumed to be quite uninterested a year ago, expectations are radically changing. Ooh, that's a little bit fuzzy. But this is now becoming that game of musical chairs. Now we're seeing employers that were hesitant to go. They were like, maybe I'll let folks do a single day work from home. Their expectations are challenging when they go out to compete for talent. More than half of employers saying their expectations around remote workforce is being driven by a shortage of talent, that they feel in the competitive landscape they have to increasingly offer more flexible environments. There's other reasons, but that is the story here. And this will speak a bit to I think actually Sharon, I want to go back to like one of Sharon's notes here in the chat. Yeah, we've seen a little bit of vax mandate. That's coming somewhat more in lower wage workers, healthcare, even aeronautics. A few fields have seen high numbers, but vaccine hesitancy is not prevailing enough to really drive these numbers. So it's a story that's true and happening, but it does not seem to be the majority of Americans are vaccinated now, and those numbers are going up. We of course still have some serious hesitancy that we need to address, but it's not a not as major contributor. This is this is a McKinsey. If you guys are able to click at this link, do. Otherwise, we will be sending the slides out. The McKinsey did another really solid deep dive in industry specific work that goes beyond the technically reporting that we do. But it speaks to some of what you thought. A theme, though, that I think as employers we're going to have to get right. The narrative has too often been employers want folks to come to the office because they want to micromanage them, and employees want to work remote because it's better for them. The story is more nuanced than that, of course. The reality is there are things that we are going to lose out in fully remote work unless you are very intentional about that remote work. And that goes back to my earlier slide. Belonging, sense of belonging among your employees, and sparks of innovation, the inefficiencies that create good ideas. Those two things are showing up as what we lose when we go entirely remote unless you very intentionally build around it. And that's showing up across industries. Of course, knowledge work is one category that particularly needs those two things, belonging and sparks of innovation. And so we need to talk openly about remote work. This is a little bit fuzzy too, but we technically, I'll make sure to include the link in the slide here, but we've done a bunch of reporting around different categories you might want to self-identify as. Maybe 20% of hours might end up entirely remote. It still will be a minority of companies, the entirely remote companies. We at the Technically side cover a fair bunch of them, but it's still a minority. The majority of companies will do some office time. Whether that will remain true forever, that is an open debate. But in the next 18 to 24 months, the majority of companies will still have some office time. But we're watching these middle categories of remote first and remote flexible evolve most quickly. Remote first is something we're seeing in a ton of our most fast growing tech companies that are clients of ours and we report on. And this is a company that might have an office in any given city. It might, Baltimore, Philadelphia, many mid-Atlantic markets, DC, they might have an office, but they are increasingly promoting their hiring offerings as remote. And if you happen to be near an office, you can take advantage of it. And they're seeing that it's purely as a way to be more competitive in the hiring landscape. We are seeing office-based folks who are saying this is going to be 4 to 5 days of work, losing out in the talent marketplace. I think if you are hiring professional, certainly tech or tech adjacent workers, but any kind of independent contributors, I think you have to be in one of these three categories to the left. I don't think the office-based option is viable for the long term, seeing what we think we see our office folks are. This is a very real reality that is still changing, and I think we need to talk about it as employers. I don't think the office option is going to last. So then that means you have to really invest in team culture. If this is not already a phrase, again, this is another, company culture is not, in my word, an empty buzzword. It is very real. And I know I'm coming up on time, so I'm going to breeze here a bit. But this is from JobVite survey of about 1,000 in-house recruiters. They're all watching and demanding increases in budget on third-party support. That includes folks who do like employer brand marketing. Yes, that's a self-serving slide because we did some sort of work. But it's also folks purely about evaluating their company culture and doing more engagement work. We might still have an office, but man, we're going to have to really think about our offsite leadership meeting or our all-team meeting and do something real. I know that for us, this is very challenging. We typically have a December all hands in person, and I just canceled it because we had a couple small COVID scares and it's still feeling stressy. So I'm doing it entirely remote, and I am live trying to adapt how we do that well. I know I'm coming up on slides, so I'm going to grow. You have to get out and be telling why anyone wants to work at your workplace. I think you should be asking yourself that question. It is very competitive right now. So, interestingly, many employers deal with too many unqualified candidates. 1,000 people are applying on Indeed. They're not necessarily qualified or know anything about your company. We're seeing a huge rage in ghosting, where a candidate is applying to 100 companies just because it's easy on Indeed or whatever. They don't actually care about your company, and they're just doing it in mass apply. So we're seeing companies want to really talk about their workplace culture or their differentiations because they want to qualify down who is interested in their work. Always noting that people who know about your company culture last longer. If someone just applies off a job site, only a quarter of them lasts more than 18 months. You get it much higher when it's through a referral, either with employer brand storytelling or an employee profile recommendation. Coming up on time, I know I'm 11:30, Kevin. I'm moving. DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. We can't lose this thread. Of course, it is abhorrent if race predicts economic outcomes. So this is a moral issue. It also is a factual strategy for hiring millennial and Gen Z professionals in the future. Noting that parental leave is abhorrent. The United States, we are behind all rich countries, and so we are seeing employers really look at their parental leave program as a way to attract those mid-career professionals who are most likely to opt out. This is my final checklist, and I will be done here in a moment. But what do you got to do right now? You got to look at your review bands. You're probably looking at minimum 5% cost of living adjustments if you want to do your budgeting for next year. If you're not already using it as a minimum, that's probably what you got to do, is like a baseline. It's going to be tough for folks who are used to 1 to 3%, COLA adjustments. You have to think about remote work and be intentional about the culture happening there. Why would someone want to work at your company? Happy to help with that sort of stuff. That's client work that we do. You're going to talk about strengthening your benefits, other perks beyond comp. If you're feeling like you can't keep up with the rates of compensation, where can you meet in other flexibility or perk culture? Think about your employer brand and employee value prop right now, because you're going to get scrutinized by the most serious professionals, and folks are investing in other tools. That's my spiel. Whew, Kevin, I think I went a couple minutes over, but that's
was very, very good. You did a great job whizzing through that, but a lot of good information. And I think we, those are the kind of things members have been talking about, and I think it's great to see it summarized like you did. And I think the key right now is adaptability. Right, you've got to, you can't lock in anything right now. You got to kind of see where things are going and see what's driving the markets. And I think you were very succinct with all that. So. We will definitely pass the slides out, and we'll also have the recording available for everybody. And I think we'll try to get Chris back in the spring and kind of give us an update on where things are at that point. But Chris, thank you very much. That was great.
Thanks, guys. Happy to talk nerdy to any of you.
So we'll turn it over to Amy at this point.